Several of you in this meeting that we had in our previous Common Ground coffee hour meeting. So thank you again for attending this one. This will be a little deeper dive into some things. So each of you knows me and already met the managers with the exception of Katrina, because we were all in the previous meeting. Katrina, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. I am a community manager for Bluestone and Hockley, and I manage Olympus Station and Dawson Station. Hi, Michael. And hi, Nancy. Good to see you guys here.
Thank you, Katrina. So I'm going to hand this over to Kim Adolph. She is going to give this presentation, and we have had the pleasure of her joining our team several months ago, like she mentioned in the previous meeting. She's very experienced, level-headed, has a great approach. And so take it away, Kim.
Awesome, thank you. Give Melissa a second here. Great, so I'm assuming everybody with us today is a current board member, maybe with some of you having more experience than others. But we can go, if you want, Melissa, to the next slide. Oh, well, there's Pam and me. We can move on. We want to talk about board members. We're going to talk a lot about what your role is, what your responsibilities are. Please feel free to interject with questions at any time. Some of this, if you were in the previous meeting, the homeowner meeting, may be a little bit, redundant of what we talked about, but it's still all very important information and information that every board member really needs to know. And we start off with and Pam talked about this before, about fiduciary responsibility and kind of what that means. And this is probably the most important thing that a board member needs to know and it needs to take very seriously, because as a fiduciary, you are acting on the behalf of other people. You are making decisions for other people. And that has a lot to do with money. You're making financial decisions on the maintenance of property, which affects the property value of all of your homeowners. You're talking about, money that you have in reserves, and you're making decisions on, where you're going to put that money, and you have to keep it safe. A lot of times boards are like, oh, but we could do this, we could invest our money and get more interest. And that's not the best choice for your community, because a lot of times that holds a lot of risk. So you're supposed to make decisions that keep your assets safe and maintains your assets. You have to do everything thinking about everyone else, not yourself. And that could be hard and can be a bit of a challenge, I know, but you really have to think about what is best for everyone. It may not be, the decision that you would make if you were making for yourself as an individual. But again, remember, you're not making decisions as an individual. You're making decisions for a lot of other people, and you need to be honest and you need to be trustworthy, because again, you're acting on the behalf. Anybody have any questions on that? It can be kind of intimidating when you really think about it, but it's probably, one of the two most important things you need to do as a board member. Okay, we can move, I think, Melissa, to the next slide. Like I said, if you have questions, just pop in and interrupt at any time. The next really important thing for a board member is the business judgment rule. You've probably all heard it. So this is one of those things that you have, it's kind of like using your common sense, but you also have professionals that you rely on. You have attorneys, you have even down to like your landscaper. They're the professional, they're the ones who are supposed to know how something is supposed to be done in whatever that specialized area is. It's the same reason that, you know, if you're going to do a roofing project, you want to have somebody develop those specifications. That's what they do, so you can rely on that. Then you also want to hire someone to oversee the work so that the contractor you hired is doing what they're supposed to do. So you're relying on all of these experts and the recommendations that they make. That's exactly what you should do. If you don't, if your attorney tells you, for instance, they're reviewing rules and you've got a rule that says, oh, no kids, are allowed in the pool, on Fridays. And your attorney is like, hey, that's you can't do that. That's discriminatory. It violates fair housing. And you're like, oh, we're going to do it anyway. Well, now you open yourself up because you're not making a prudent decision based on the advice of your expert. You open yourself up for personal liability. And I think it's important for board members to understand that you have D&O insurance, directors and officers insurance, and that protects you from personal liability for the decisions you're making on behalf of the association, but not if you're making decisions that are illegal or you are blatantly not following, advice of legal counsel is a good one. You can open yourself up to be personally sued and your D&O insurance will not cover you. So that's really important to understand and to understand how that all works together. Anybody have questions on that? Because I know a lot of times people get very concerned about being a board member and being sued. And you should feel comfortable knowing that if you're following this business judgment rule, you're following the advice of your experts, you are protected in your decisions that you make. Any questions there? Okay. So when we get into the more fun stuff. So how are you elected? Your homeowners. Your homeowners in your community, they vote. They decide who sits on the board. You can nominate yourself. You can nominate, other members of your community, although they do have to accept that. Get to play tricks on them and, hey, surprise, now you're on the board. Okay, Betty just had a question. You can go straight to the contractor and not hire, someone to oversee the project. But there's nothing illegal about doing that, and a lot of communities do. But you run the risk of maybe they didn't do something correctly, and that's where are you liable? Do you mean like, so if there was something that didn't work, so if you had a roof leak, no, you are not liable. You would then go back against that contractor because you should have a warranty, and you should be able to go back against them. But what happens a lot of times, like sticking with the roofing project, you'll have maybe the flashing wasn't done right, or the building paper wasn't installed right. And when you have a third party that goes and they spot check these things and they find something that's wrong, right at that point, the contractor has to go backwards and now fix all of that. And then your consultant comes back to make sure they've done it correctly. So what it does is it saves you a lot of headache down the road when maybe they didn't install that flashing correctly. I have what I'm dealing with where the roofing contractor didn't install the flashing correctly around skylights, and there wasn't a consultant overseeing the project, and now we have some serious roof leaks and damage. So it just, now you've got a whole bunch of other problems that you're dealing with. If that didn't answer your question completely, Betty, let me know. It's just it's a worthwhile investment and protection for everyone. All right, we'll go back to how you're elected. All right, thank you. So your homeowners, generally every year, you have an annual membership meeting, and we'll talk about different meetings here in a minute, and that's where board members are elected. You have anywhere from 3, I've seen up to 9 board positions, but that's generally in a much larger community. It's more common to see 3 or 5, sometimes 7. And your terms and how many board members you have, that your bylaws lay that out. And it's different for every community. As Pam said in the meeting before, you all have the same types of documents that you have to follow and regulate your community, but they're all just slightly different. So you really have to go back and refer to your own. Generally, terms are staggered so that you don't have the whole board turnover all at once, although I've seen them where all 5 one-year terms. The nice part about having them staggered is you have some continuity. And, so when you have new board members coming in, you've got some board members that have been involved in the projects and the things that are going on to take that forward instead of, having to start over and everybody has to learn what's going on. So that's why you have the staggered terms. Your role, the people get kind of confused sometimes when they're electing board members. They think, oh, so, Betty's running for the board. She's running, because the current board president's position there, is up. So she's running for president. Well, it's not like that. You're running for a position on the board, and then the board members themselves decide who will hold which officer position. And that's decided among themselves. And we have 3 primary officer positions. You have the president, the secretary, and the treasurer. And then if you have more than 3 members on your board, you typically just have director positions. And those directors might not have as active as the role, but they will, a lot of times, when you have projects going on, they will step in and help with oversight on those projects. So it just kind of spreads the work, more evenly amongst the board members. And your board members, the directors and officers, I think we're going to delve into, if we can go to the next slide, Melissa. Thank you. So this is, a lot to read. So if you kind of read through it, I'm just going to kind of skim over it for you. But you have a chairperson or a president. It depends on how your documents call it out. And your chairperson is the chief executive officer. And again, you are a corporation, you're a business. So they are responsible for running the meetings, for making the decisions. Your board president also generally has the authority to appoint committees and appoint members to these committees. Although I often see that as a board decision, typically it's, boards deciding that they want to establish a committee for something and then, moving forward with that. Your board president also works with setting the agenda. A lot of times the secretary and the board president will work together in conjunction with your manager. And it really should be all 3, or at least the board president and the manager, working on the agenda and preparing those so that they get out to the homeowners and the other board members prior to the meeting. Any questions on the board president's role? Okay. Sometimes you have a vice president, not too often, but some documents do call for that. And that person basically is just what you would think. They stand in for the president. When the president is not available, or the president, they can't attend a meeting for whatever reason, then the vice president or vice chair would step in and run that meeting and work with the manager, just like the president would do. The secretary. Secretary is a pretty important job. Your secretary is recording the minutes of your meeting. They're taking the minutes of that meeting. I think now we're asking that whether president and chair are interchangeable. And Pam, you might step in on this because I believe they are pretty much interchangeable. You'll see it referenced in the bylaws as to whether they're referencing a chair or a president.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is, in my opinion, I've only seen it be the same thing, just named something. But I think it's important, whatever your documents call it is what your community should call it.
Right, right. And you are correct that when you have a committee, you have a chairperson of that committee generally. And that chairperson on a committee kind of has the same role as the president or the chair of the board. They're in charge of organizing and running and keeping things going the way that they should. Again, if I didn't answer the question completely, just pop up another one. The secretary, again, very, very important role. Secretary taking the minutes of the meetings. And we're going to talk about minutes and what should be in those in a minute. But, you know, your minutes are a legal record of your association. So it's important that they're accurate. And again, we'll talk about content of minutes in a little bit. The secretary is also the one, if you do not have a vice president or vice chair, your secretary will step in and to the place of, in the absence of your president. So if the president is unable to attend a meeting, the secretary would be the one who would be running the meeting, chairing the meeting for that particular meeting. If you have a situation where, you know, maybe, you know, your president is going to be, you know, maybe out of the country and unavailable, and typically for managers, you know, we're the president association is our go-to person. That's the one that we get our direction from, you know, in between meetings, or we go to with the, you know, the questions that might come up. So say your board president is going to be out of the country, then that secretary would step in, and that would be our go-to person, the person that would be, you know, giving us the direction that we need and responding to the questions that we have. So again, a pretty important role. Any questions on secretary's role? Okay, and then the treasurer. While all board members should always review your financial statements, and all of you know that, you know, at Bluestone and Hockley on the 10th of the month, we send out your operating report, and that includes your financials. It includes an explanation of any variances over a certain percentage or dollar amount. It includes all your bills. You know, it also includes things on delinquencies. So there's a lot of other information, but there's a lot of financial information in there. And while the treasurer is typically the person who really reviews that, all board members should. I think it's very important. You should rely on your treasurer, but you should also be aware of what's happening and, you know, the movement of money, you know, the bills that are being paid. You know, several sets of eyes are better than just one. You know, you see, you know, people focus on different things. We all do when we look at things. We focus on, you know, maybe utilities. You know, that's one person that's like, oh, what's the utility? And they really drill down on that. Well, others are looking at, you know, delinquencies or, you know, aged receivables, something like that. So everybody should be looking at that. Your treasurer is also going to work with your CPA. They're going to work with your CPA while they're preparing your financial review every year. So there's some other interaction there that will take place. You know, we pay your bills, so, you know, your treasurer isn't actively having to do that. We're processing those and taking care of all of that. And again, I think Pam talked about this in the prior meeting too. So I apologize for being redundant if you were in that meeting, but there's, I'm losing my chain of thought now on myself. There's, okay, I'm sorry, I lost my whole train of thought there, you guys, so I apologize on that. Does anybody have any questions on any of the roles of the board members? I think another thing to point out on board members is that at any time, the board can decide that they would change the officer positions. It doesn't have to be done annually. Sometimes people get in and you may have again, you're all volunteers and things in your life can change. So I find a lot of people that are on boards are afraid I'm not going to have enough time to do something. So you can always make that change. So if something changes in your life and say you're the secretary and now all of a sudden you've got something in your life and you feel that that's too big of a role for you, that's something that you as board members can talk about and decide that, oh, okay, well, Sally can't be the secretary, so now Joe is going to take over and maybe Sally's just going to be a director at large. And kind of take that away. So keep that in mind, because I know a lot of times, depending on what's going on in your association, it can get very busy and it can feel like a burden, and that's not what you want. Does anybody have any questions? No questions? Gosh, guys. Okay, let's talk about meetings. There's typically 3 types of meetings. You have regular board meetings, and that's the business meeting for the board. Obviously, homeowners are allowed to attend those, and you have an open forum during those meetings where your homeowners have the opportunity to, ask questions of the board or make comments. That's your business meeting. That's where you're making your decisions. You're reviewing any proposals, going forward and doing that. We're going to talk about an executive session in a few minutes. You also have annual meetings. Those are owner meetings. And those are typically where you're going to have elections of board members. Sometimes if your documents require it, homeowners have to approve the budget every year. And so that would be typically done, not always, it might have to be a special meeting, but typically done at an annual meeting as well. But those are the 2 typical things you see done there. Then there'll be special meetings, and special meetings can be special meetings of the board or of the owners. Board members may have special meetings when they're working on projects. Special owner meetings can be things such as you're voting on, so maybe you're amending your governing documents and you're going to do a vote in a meeting. So that would be a special owners meeting. You could also have that happen at your annual meeting as well, if you're amending your documents, and some associations will do that. Other things, and hopefully this doesn't happen because it's never fun, but if there is to be a recall of the board or a board member, that would be done in a special meeting. And hopefully none of you have to ever experience that. Does anybody have any questions? I feel like we're really rolling through this stuff. Anybody have any questions on different types of meetings, or maybe you've had and even, some of the managers who are on here, have you had any other types of meetings that you would think would fall into these categories that you'd like to share? Yes, Nancy.
I do have a question about special meetings of the board. You had mentioned in your brief comments that these would be meetings when the board is working on special projects. Those still have to follow the Oregon open meeting law?
Absolutely, yes. Yep.
But unlike a regular board meeting, monthly meeting, it can be focused on a single topic.
Yes, that's been my experience. When there's a need for a special meeting, it is a particular topic that the board is talking about. a project that they're working on, which requires, more meetings because decisions have to be made more quickly than once a month. Again, I invite anybody else who's had, special meetings to chime in and share, what those were about.
I'd like to
I
talk
would
about,
add,
go ahead, Mike.
I would just say that this morphs over into another topic, and that is email correspondence between the boards, which you may be addressing. But I was going to go back to something that we just encountered in our association. We're having a difficult time finding volunteers to fill the board. And so at our last annual meeting, in desperation, we almost appointed somebody just because they had sort of expressed an interest but didn't attend the meeting. And fortunately, we looked at the bylaws and determined, even if you just have one board member, that board member can appoint and fill all the vacancies. But once you get somebody on the board, then you need a vote of the association to remove a board member. So we decided that better to have a vacancy for a while and do a little quality control to make sure we get the right people on the board, which could have been a trap if we hadn't checked the bylaws.
Yeah, very good point. And that is, interestingly, the one thing that if you're down to where you don't have a quorum of board members, if you have a 5-person board and you're the last person standing on that board, that's the one thing you can do, is appoint other board members. But you're absolutely right. Once they're appointed, once they're on the board, it takes a vote of the membership to remove them. And that's another one that it's interesting that kind of trips people up, because they'll read the documents. I know it did me when I was a brand new manager. I read that and I got so excited, because I thought it was going to help this board, because they had they unfortunately, one of the board members was just really quite unruly and disruptive, and they wanted to get rid of him. And and you read that section that says that they can be, the board could remove an officer. Well, that's the key word. They can remove an officer. So, say for instance, the board president is just, disrespectful to homeowners and argumentative, and the rest of the board is, frustrated by that. Well, the board can vote to remove him from that officer position and take him out of the president's position and just put him in a director's position. But they can't remove him from the board completely. So really, really good point. Yeah, and think about that. Don't just fill a position, because you need to fill a position. You want to make sure that, I think like all homeowners, when they vote for a board member, you want to make sure that, this person does have the best interest of the association in mind, because it can be a trap.
Hey, Kim, can I go back to the additional meetings?
Yes, please.
So Nancy, one time I managed a large community, and it seemed like forever, for years and years, they always had so many things to cover, and they were an aging community. And so the board set a work session, and it would be, on the off 2 weeks of the board meeting. So you'd have a board meeting, then 2 weeks have the work session, and then 2 weeks more have the board meeting. But still, they were required to notify, but owners weren't given an opportunity to speak in the work sessions, and they could just observe, the deliberation. And so that's how that community handled it. Every 2 weeks they had that meeting, because they felt they wanted to be more prepared for their board meeting. So
yeah, I one time managed a community that kind of did the same thing as what Pam was talking about. They would have a working meeting the week before their board meeting, and they noticed it. It was a properly noticed meeting, and same kind of thing. It wasn't open to homeowner interaction, just observation. And that way, when they went into their board meeting the following week, if there was any work that any of them needed to do or clarification needed, that it was able to be taken care of. So when they got to the board meeting, they were making those decisions. But that doesn't happen too much. Anybody else?
Can I throw something else in
Yeah.
on the regular board meeting? You know, it's been referenced, or, you know, all of it's an open forum for owners to bring up any issue they want. But I think it's really important, if it's at all possible, that as you get to an action item, if there are members of the community that are particularly interested in that action item and they have something to say about it, I really believe that you can, you know, open a mini forum and let them, because they may have some factual information that is really usable to the board, and to strictly restrict them it might get in the way of good decision making. And on the other hand, you can't let people, I mean, it is a board meeting, it's not a member meeting, and you can't let them dominate it. But somewhere in between there's a happy medium that depends largely on the size of the meeting, of course, but
Yep.
I think there is some flexibility there.
I think you're right. I think you always have to have flexibility, and one of the things you can do, especially if it's a big item or a, you know, or a more emotional type of item that, you know, people are going to have thoughts and opinions on, you know, it's specifically set it up to have some, you know, homeowner interaction, but time it, limit how much time, you know, that they can talk about it. I've also, when I've had situations like that, I've used, and of course, it's a little bit more difficult to do, you know, with video meetings, but not impossible. We would have, when people would come in and sign in, if they wanted to speak to the topic, we had them fill out a form, and then the board president would work from that. And that kind of really helped, and it helped with setting the time limit. And you could still do. I have one of my boards that I work with right now. They ask homeowners to submit questions that they may have, you know, a couple days prior to the meeting, so that, you know, the board members have time to look at those and be more prepared to answer those questions at the meeting. So there's a lot of tools like that. But yes, I think you always have to be flexible, because you know, topics change, homeowners' needs change, and you know, it's emotional, it's personal, it's your home, it's your community, it's where you spend the majority of your time.
I personally have rarely ever seen a board not allow owners to chime in here and there, as long as they're respectful. When I've seen it become more structured and limited to, you know, an open forum, is when there's a lot of, I've seen a lot of belligerent owners as well, out of control, negative, and that's when it has more structure. But yeah, I rarely see that, Mike, that the board doesn't allow that.
Yeah. Anybody else have a question or comment or something they'd like to share?
Yeah, did you cover Robert's rules in this? I had to step out for a few minutes, so I missed some of it.
No, nope, we did not. And we weren't going to go into a lot of detail and on this, but you know, it's interesting, because Robert's rules can be very intimidating. I find them very intimidating. And I also find that a lot of boards don't really follow them to the T. They're not that regulated. And so we do have some cheat sheets. If y'all would like those, I think we can certainly send them out. I find them helpful. In fact, we just had a meeting with an attorney for the last week, I think, some of our in-house educational stuff. And one of the things that I really took away from what he said is that don't panic over Robert's rules and whether you follow them correctly, as long as you don't limit the amount of time that someone, you know, can express, and you allow people to express, you know, their thoughts and their opinions, then any decision that the board makes, even if they didn't follow Robert's rules correctly, won't be nullified, because you gave opportunity for discussion. And that's the key thing. You know, I think most boards kind of do things backwards. They have discussion before they have a motion and a second. And technically, you're supposed to have a motion, and if you don't get a second, it dies and it's done. And I think a lot of times some board members don't want to make a motion or second it because they feel like they're supporting it, when maybe they want to vote no, but you're not. What you're technically doing is opening up an action item for proper discussion. So it's, I think Robert's rules are very loosely used, and which I don't know is necessarily a bad thing. Like Pam said, I think most meetings we go to are really pretty casual meetings, and nobody is at each other's throats, or anything like that. But I have seen where it can really come into play and be very necessary depending on, the mood of the community and what's going on. And if you have, it's a horrible term to say, but if you have, disruptors, who come to the meeting continuously, just to, be antagonistic, then you might need something, more restrictive. And I think I saw somebody popped up and asked for the Robert's Rules of Orders, and I'm sure we can get those out to everybody. Because what was it? What did they say? I can't even remember how many pages, like 700 pages crazy, absolutely crazy.
That's what Ryan said.
Yeah, and it can be, excuse me, it can be a little intimidating, but again, the really important thing that I took away from what the attorney said was let people talk, give them that opportunity, and any decisions you make won't be nullified because everyone had opportunity to speak. Would you say I hit that correctly, Pam?
Can I call you back in
Okay.
about 20 minutes?
All right. Any other questions on this? Okay. We can, I think, there you go. Thank you. So, good agendas and bad agendas. And I just have to say, I think this is the only industry where we constantly talk about dog poop. I'm sorry, I find it humorous, but I think everybody will agree with me, especially every manager. So we have a couple examples here of a good agenda and a bad agenda. And really we'll focus on the good agenda because you want to make sure place, date, time, really important. And if you can put your, like your Zoom login information on there as well is really good, because then it's right there on that document and people don't necessarily have to search for it. So obviously you want to call the order. You need to call the meeting to order. And you also not, you want to, they call it roll call, but it's really introductions, I think. And I think it's really good to do because quite often you'll have new homeowners in a meeting who've never been before and they don't necessarily know who everybody is and what their role is. So doing a roll call and announcing, establishing your quorum to hold the meeting is important. Then you have the approval of minutes from the prior meeting. And again, these are board decisions because we're at a board meeting, not an annual meeting. And then reports. And sometimes you won't necessarily have reports as a separate section because it may fall, sorry, it may fall under unfinished business or new business. So you don't necessarily have to have reports, but a lot of times, associations do, especially a treasurer's report. And again, sometimes a manager's report. But again, I think most of the time what we find is under unfinished and new business. And this doesn't show bulleted items under unfinished and new business, but you would add those in, so everybody understands what's on the agenda and what you're going to be discussing. But you don't want to, kind of use that detail, like over on the bad agenda. You could have, painting proposals, you could have, review of collection policy, whatever you want in there, but you don't want to name out names, or call people out. That's not the purpose at all. And then you have the open forum. Now you could do open forum in the very beginning of the meeting if you want to. You can do it at the end of the meeting. You can put your open forum wherever you want. I've actually had boards that do open forum at the beginning and at the end of the meeting. So it's what that open forum is what works for you, for your community. And, you know, if you have an item, to speak back to what Michael was saying, if you have a business item that you really feel you're going to want some community input, you might want to add that onto your agenda. So you've got, you know, you've got the agenda item on there, and then list as a bullet under it, open forum, specifically for that. So then people understand that they will have an opportunity to talk. And, you know, and that I think that makes people feel better, you know, and you maybe if it's, again, emotional, you'll kind of calm that a little bit. Then you need to set the date for your next meeting. And I think it's important, even if you meet the third Thursday of every month, I think it's really good to have it on the agenda, the actual date and the time, so that people know. Because sometimes you may have people, you know, like, hey, I'm not going to be here, and so you might not have a quorum. So you want to make sure that you establish that before you adjourn the meeting. And then, of course, you adjourn the board meeting. Any questions on agendas? One of the things, and I'm just going to throw this in because we are still going to talk about executive session. If you know that you're going to go into an executive session, or you think you might need to, put it on your agenda. That the board is going to adjourn and go into executive session, and then on your agenda as well, it should show you reconvening and coming out of executive session. And I'll wait until we get to the executive session topic to talk a little bit more about that. But you know, it's a good thing to have on there so that people are prepared for it, because obviously your homeowners, if you're going into executive session, your homeowners can't participate in that. But it's better that they know it up front, so they know that for a while they're going to be out of the meeting. Again, it's just, you know, letting people know so that they have an idea of what they're walking into, instead of like, well, gosh, if you told me you were, you know, going to call the order and go into executive session, I would have waited to, you know, log into the meeting. So it's just information and people can make their choices. Okay, let's talk about minutes. So we've kind of got some sample minutes here for you to look at. And I've had so many secretaries over the years, you know, they're unsure about what should be in the minutes. And then you get people that say, well, I said this during open forum, why isn't it in the minutes? Or you have somebody who tries to put in a comment from open forum, and then the person says, I didn't say that. So minutes are important. They're a legal record, a legal document of your association. And I, way back when I first started association management, I had an attorney, and I think every single attorney would say the same thing. Your minutes are for motions and directives. They're not for conversation. Your secretary is not a recording secretary. You shouldn't try to record specific comments from people because you might misrepresent what they're saying. And your minutes are to reflect the decisions made by the board, so that there is a record of those decisions. So if anybody needs to go back, it's very clear what happened. So as we kind of look at this, and you can see down under the open forum, that's perfect. Homeowner discussion regarding vandalism, homeowner discussion regarding window washing. Don't need the details of that discussion. Just like you don't need the details of the board discussion on motion. That's why we have open meetings and the discussion. And Michael actually said something about this earlier, and we didn't continue talking about it, but that's email discussion with boards, and it's not proper. All your discussion needs to be in your meeting. Your homeowners need to be able to hear it and see what's being done. It's being transparent again in everything that you do, and that rolls right back into, you know, part of your fiduciary responsibility. You know, being open with your homeowners, being honest with your homeowners. It's not always easy, because many times you're going to have to talk about things that are uncomfortable. Probably one of the biggest things you're going to have to talk about in an open meeting is dealing with homeowner violations and homeowner hearings. That could be really uncomfortable for the board, and it could be really uncomfortable for the homeowner who is, there having a hearing, because all the other homeowners are there to hear it and hear what goes on. And that can be very uncomfortable, but you don't have a choice. It has to be done in an open meeting. And so I think that when you're going to have a hearing, it's really important to know ahead of time how that's going to be handled and to communicate it to the homeowner who's coming to the hearing. Okay, question about names. I think it's important to put names of who's made motions. I don't know if it's a legal requirement, and maybe Pam can chime in on that, but I think it's important because, again, it's a record. I don't think there's any, so if you didn't have, you notice that these were all in favor and motion passed, but they might not be. You might have somebody that, abstained, or you might have somebody that voted no. And I don't think you're required to put down who voted, which way someone voted, but
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, but you would need to record it if somebody voted no. Yeah, and
I think it is important to put who abstained, though. When it's a board making a decision, we do occasionally have board members abstain, and I think that's important to list.
Yeah, because generally when they're abstaining, it's because they feel there's a conflict of interest for them.
Right, correct.
It could be something in relation to their unit that the board is approving, so they're going to abstain, so that they aren't, they have no conflict there. But going back to the hearing, I think it's important that the homeowner knows what to expect, and that the board knows what to expect when you have a hearing, because they can be very difficult, very uncomfortable for everybody. And what that process is really depends on your board and your community. But I would just say the last thing you want to do is get into a back and forth with people. I always tell my boards and the homeowner, this is the homeowner's opportunity to address the board regarding whatever the violation is, to give their side of what happened. And then the board, if they have specific questions that they need clarification on, that's what they should ask. And only that. They shouldn't, get into, well, you should know better. You've had the rules. It's not a time to reprimand. And then once that dialogue has happened, then the really hard part comes. And that's where the board has to decide if they're going to uphold the fine or not. And you're sitting right in front of that person, and it can be very uncomfortable, but you have to make that decision. So you can make a decision right then and there, or you can say the board's going to take it under advisement. And that doesn't mean you go all have coffee and talk about it, or you start emailing about it. That means individually you're going to go away and think about it. Then you're going to come back to another open meeting and you're going to make a decision. So that's the way to handle those. Does anybody have any questions about hearings, the process? Mike, you're muted. Okay, I'm not sure if Michael is talking to us or somebody else. Oh.
Okay, I just checked my records for dummies. And I was surprised it says the name of the name of the person who seconds the motion isn't entered unless ordered by the membership, which that was surprising. I was kind of going along with what you were saying, but every version of Roberts has a slightly different interpretation of some of these things.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah. And again, I don't know that there's any legal requirement for that. If you're really concerned, I would ask, I would say consult with your own legal counsel and go by what they say, is the proper way to record that.
The one thing I would say about Roberts, I like to use Roberts Light, where you make sure that people understand that, as you pointed out, you make a motion, that just starts a discussion process, and you can amend the motion. And I think used that way, it gets some of the intimidation out of the way. Unfortunately, we've all had the experience of somebody who was a Roberts Nazi that used it to control the meeting, and that just taints it. But the alternative is, and we've all seen this too often, there's a 20-minute discussion of some topic and somebody says, I move we do what we just talked about. And nobody really knows
What it was.
specifically what we just talked about.
Yes, yeah. And that's why I think
love that.
sometimes if you've had one of those where you go back and forth, and sometimes I've seen motions get amended 3-4 times, and then it's like, okay, read back the motion, and you have the secretary read it back, because sometimes it's hard for the secretary who's trying to take the notes to, you're trying to follow that bouncing ball. So yeah, I think reading them back's a good idea. Do we have any other questions on minutes? I know we're getting close to the end of time here. Okay, now our favorite discussion, executive session. Executive session is closed to owners, but the board is limited as to what you can discuss in an executive session meeting. And those are listed here. And when it says personnel matters, you need to have an employee to discuss personnel matters. That doesn't mean you're discussing a homeowner and their hearing or their violation. You can, one of the things I think that also gets confusing now, you look down there and it says collection of unpaid assessments. So you can, what I've been told by many attorneys, and again, always go by what your attorney tells you, is that you can go into executive session to discuss the unpaid assessment. But again, like with any other decision you're going to make, you have to come back into an open meeting, and you need to make that decision in the open meeting. And it doesn't mean you have to give out people's names, or anything else like that. A lot of times we'll like number collection issues, and so they'll be referred to that way. I've had them referred to by lot number or something, but that's kind of obvious. You want to be careful. But let's just talk about executive session and how you hold an executive session. Because it's kind of confusing. You have to call an open meeting with very few exceptions. And so you call your meeting to order, you adjourn into executive session, and you have to give detail as to what you're going into executive session for. You could be, and you could say to consult with legal counsel. You could say to discuss, your delinquencies, or, because you're trying to determine, what next legal step you might take. But you do have to give some kind of detail. You can't just say, oh, the board's going into executive session now. And then the board goes into executive session and you have discussions. And you can even decide what action you're going to take, from that. And then you have to go back into and reconvene your open session. And that's where you make your decisions. That's where you will then motion for whatever decision was made that the board wanted to make. You don't take minutes of executive session. So your action, your direction needs to be in your open minutes, because it's not valid until that happens. And you might come out of an executive session and just simply state, there's no action to be taken, because sometimes if you're just consulting with legal counsel, that's just it. There might be advising you on something, and you aren't going to really take any action from it. So you would just come back out, and I think it's good if you come back out just to say, you know, there's no action to be taken at this time, and then you can move on. And that's kind of spelled out down there in item C on this. Now, emergencies. That's kind of, you know, I've had those come up, and generally it's legal in nature is what you're dealing with, where the boards had to call an emergency meeting, but we still notice it. We still send out an agenda. We still allow, you know, homeowners to come in. And when we're doing it electronically, like our meetings are, there's a couple of different ways you can do this. You can have one meeting link that goes out, and after you call the meeting to order and you're going to adjourn to executive session, you can put all the homeowners into a waiting room. And then when you come out of executive session, you can put them all back into the meeting. Or you can have a separate link for the board members only. So the board members exit the meeting and they log into a separate meeting for the executive session. I think it just kind of depends on what works best, you know, for you. If you have a large amount of people attending the meeting, homeowners, it might be easier to, you know, for the board members to log into a different link to hold the executive session. So it's kind of a tricky thing, but I think the best rule of thumb is just to remember, have to open a regular meeting. You have to adjourn yourself into executive session, and then you have to come back out, reconvene, and make your decisions in the open meeting. Questions on that? Pam, did I miss anything on that?
Nope, I think you've got it. Did you reiterate, Kim? I didn't hear you say, really in simple terms, the only thing that executive session protects is the deliberation. Everything else, right? So your motion going in, and that would be included in your minutes, and then your decision when you've come out in your minutes.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any questions on executive session? And remember that you can't go into executive session to deliberate on that hearing. That doesn't get to go into executive session, unfortunately.
Unless, Kim, I've seen boards do this, and maybe it's not the intent, but invite your attorney, and you can get advice from your attorney on something in the executive session on anything.
Yes.
And so if you're not quite sure about that violation and it's a tough one, invite your attorney, and then you can go into executive session.
Yeah, that's true. And it kind of depending on what that violation is, it may be far more complicated than just, you know, I left my trash can out for 3 days, you know, every week for a month. You know, so you want, yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you, Pam. Okay, we're at 12 o'clock, so I want to get us wrapped up here. Our last item are governing documents and the hierarchy of those documents. And we have if Melissa, we could go to the next slide. I think it's got the list. Yeah, it's kind of hard to read, but yeah, there's a lot of rules to follow. And knowing the hierarchy of the documents, I think is pretty important because, you know, you've got first off, you start with our Constitution and you think, well, wait, we have our own governing documents. Well, there's a lot of other things that fall into place and will trump your governing documents. Federal law, fair housing is a big one. There's a lot of things in fair housing that will affect. One big one I can think of is reasonable accommodation. And if you haven't dealt with reasonable accommodation, you probably will at some point. And that will trump whatever your documents say. You have state laws, and boy, do you have state laws. And Tam covered this in the prior meeting because you've got some laws that govern you if you are a condominium, and you've got some that govern you if you are a planned community or single family home. Then you have your plat. And that really, those are your floor plans. That really defines your unit. What is the unit space? Then you have, of course, county and city ordinances. Then you get down to your declaration or CCNRs. You see them called both. And amazingly, the deed to your unit. That quite often can come into play. Sometimes that could be with parking spaces and how they're deeded to units where they might not be in, you might not find those in your governing documents. Then you have your articles of incorporation and then your bylaws. And then under those bylaws, you have your rules and your resolutions that you have adopted. And those have to be adopted, so they're in accordance with your, your bylaws and your declaration and all these other things above them that come into play. Questions on any of that? It can get very complicated. And this is generally, when you get into this arena here, this is when you're going to start talking to your attorney to make sure that, you can do that. We get things like, you want to have a cap on rentals, and you'd be surprised sometimes, so you're going to, you're like, oh, we can do a resolution, but then you get back into some of these really old documents and they don't give you the authority to adopt a resolution. So you're looking at an amendment. So when you start getting into these things, you really do need to go back to legal counsel to find out what you're doing and to make sure you're doing it the correct way. Do we have any other questions on anything? I don't know if we had any other, I missed as people were popping them into the chat or anything. Anybody? No, it's been a long morning. Well, thank you all so much. We really appreciate everybody coming. And I know that if you want a copy of this or the PDF of the presentation and stuff, Melissa is more than happy to send that out to everybody. And again, thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim, and everybody for coming. Have a good day.
Thanks.